Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa, and welcome into the Hoon. I'm Bernard Hickey, a co-host here in France today. In the background, you can see a place in France, near Lyon, actually. And Peter, there in Hoon Bay. Great to see you,
Yes,
Peter Bale.
yes, Bernard. And at the end of this, we're going to have to do a conversation about council valuations and discuss why my house has lost $100,000 theoretical value this year.
That you are $100,000 poorer, and this is going to affect your spending decisions.
It's going to affect my attitude. That's right. Well, we'll talk about that towards the end of the show. And bonjour, Bernard. I should say bonsoir because it's bonsoir here, but it's bonjour there. Are you having fun?
I am.
I mean, it was Calimera. Calimera, of course, was the last one on Greece, and I forgot to say Calimera.
No worries. I apologise to everyone who was sort of expecting me to be on. We had some data issues. I could go into detail about issues with eSIM cards and data hotspots in Greece, but doesn't matter. I'm here.
No, it worked fine, and people were relieved not to see you in your studios. Really, Bernard. I think was the main thing.
Yeah, no, we're really enjoying ourselves, and if we're really lucky, in the background, a bit like when you were in London and a fox turned up in the background of your show. We might have a hare turn up in the background. Yesterday morning we had this big old hunking hare. He had like shoulders. He looked like he worked out.
Yeah,
and he had.
They do work. Yeah, absolutely. Well, they're quite good runners, as you know.
Oh yeah,
and they use all fours.
It's true.
And ultimately, the tortoise is faster, as we know.
Yeah, he did look a bit arrogant. He looked a bit, but he also looked nervous. There was this thing about he was like he had this sort of twitchy thing about him. Is there a
French farmer there with a deux chevaux or a bicycle covered in onions with a shotgun?
Actually, no. We're surrounded by cherry trees, and
how nice.
the most trouble he's probably going to get is when the water turns on automatically and sprays him. But no, it's been a lovely trip. We're very lucky. Lynn and I sometimes go to Europe to celebrate our wedding and to have a bit of a break in the middle of winter. We haven't done this for a couple of years, so it's very. No,
it's wonderful.
Very nice.
It's great to see you, and it's wonderful that you're getting out there and using up some carbon.
I'm very lucky to.
Releasing some carbon.
We save up our carbon allocations and blow them all on a trip, and also we're very lucky that we've got people who can help us to do things. In some of the other work we do. For the first time, we've been able to just completely turn off. It's been wonderful, and you did an amazing job last week, Peter.
Well, that's kind
keeping
of keeping
things.
It's still
going.
It's still the Bernard show with me keeping your seat warm. But so we've got quite a nice show today. I think so I just do a little bit of a run through about what we booked. Because I'm kind of booking it in a sense. Not that our star booker, i.e. me. We have Sir Robert Patman, Professor Robert Patman on from Otago on the international section, but we also have a special guest on from Kiev, which is a friend of mine, Andrew Gunn, who is a freelance New Zealand journalist living in Kiev, and he's going to give us a sense of what life is like there at the moment, what the atmosphere is, what he's been picking up from the people of Ukraine, because it's kind of easy for Ukraine when everything else is happening to sort of slightly slide away, other than of course the interest in its extraordinary drone attacks on Russia a week or so ago. I also want to talk with Robert, or we want to talk with Robert about AUKUS, and it would appear the likelihood that the United States may well dump AUKUS, or certainly take back the submarines that they've been proposed to give to Australia, which I think might be a relief to Australia, and we'll talk about that. And there's a lot going on, as always, with the Israel-Palestine story. New Zealand has joined, I think, 5 other countries in imposing travel sanctions, although the others have gone further on other types of sanctions on the 2 extreme right-wing members of the Netanyahu cabinet, which has had all sorts of fallout. So we'll be talking about that. And I just have got a note from MFAT about a rather remarkable démarche that's come out this afternoon from the United States, essentially threatening the United Nations and any other country that attends a conference scheduled in Saudi Arabia later this month to discuss the Israel-Palestine situation. So we'll talk about that with Robert. It's literally just landed about half an hour ago. Then we've got Catherine, and I did take a note from somebody the other day who said I introduced the three professors, the decorum of professors, and didn't note that Dr. Catherine Dyer had already been on. So Dr. Dyer will be on with her dire news about the climate. You're going to do, I think, a couple of soliloquies, Bernard, one possibly on the petulant Adrian Orr or the incompetent and petulant head of the board of the Bank of New Zealand, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, or the finance minister. I'd like you to sort of parse who was the biggest dickhead in that. Yeah, culprit, not dickhead, culprit. That's a very good way to put it. And these council valuations that came in this week.
Oh, yes, because the CVs are in. Yep.
Yes, that's right. That's right. It is an interesting thing about one's perception of one's wealth, and you have some really good theories about how that might affect the real world.
That's right. It's something that I think really matters for our housing market with bits tacked on economy. That when people are looking to move on and crystallize their wealth by selling and retiring or shutting down a business, opening a new business, moving some wealth around, retiring to the regions. Those decisions are based on whether you think you're getting the right price for your property.
Exactly. And the right price and what you perceived, because as we both know, and you've made me really understand here, and I know it from the past, but how one's kind of accrued wealth, whether it's your stock portfolio, your KiwiSaver, your 401k, but most particularly in New Zealand, your house is a kind of store of wealth that you perceive you have access to if you need it, and of course that you can borrow against.
Yeah, and for New Zealanders, it's so focused on usually the home you own and live in, that unlike, let's say, if you're relying on a stock portfolio, which has some diversification, which means if there's some sort of shock, it's unlikely to, cut 20 or 30% off the value in a moment. And for New Zealanders, they understand that markets go up and markets go down, or at least they go up and then they stop and then they go up again. And for the first time, we've now had an extended period where prices have gone down, and not just by a little bit. In 2009-10, they dropped around about 10%. But by 2010-11, they were back to their peaks again and rising. But this time around, once we got to a peak at the end of 2021, we dropped around 20 to 30%, depending on where you were. And there's been some bounce back, but it's not much at all. And for a lot of people, they're still at CVs and levels that are down, a good 10 to 20%. And for a lot of people, they just won't accept it. They don't think that that's how New Zealand works. You just
don't do your soliloquy before your soliloquy, will you?
Okay, there we go. And
we just pull the string in your chest and away you go.
It's good. No, it's good fun.
Now here we've got Catherine. I want to talk about media at some point in the show, so maybe towards the end when we do our skateboarding dog, because there's been more journalists killed in Gaza, and people will have seen the extraordinary scenes of, I think now 5 journalists injured by various projectiles in Los Angeles, one of whom, the Australian journalist, appears to have been deliberately shot by somebody with a one of those, they call them baton rounds, which is like we call them rubber bullets, but they're actually much bigger than that. Catherine, speaking of Dr. Dyer, I told you that the crew last week, some of the audience were irritated that I talked about the 3 professors, the trio of professors, but not your doctorate. Hello.
Not a professor.
Exactly.
Not a professor, just a doctor here.
Wonderful. So go ahead and tell us.
Wonderful to see you, Catherine. Fantastic.
Yeah, you too, Bernard.
Yeah.
Look like you're getting some sun.
I know. It's wonderful. No, we're very, very lucky. Super hot here, like 35 degrees, and it really surprised me at how hard it is to exist when it's like this all day, every day. But you go for it. On what is it that you wanted to focus on to start with?
So the first one was the situation where we have a whole lot of lawyers, hundreds of lawyers, in fact, taking the unworthies to court. So that's quite entertaining. So ELI and Alkanzi, so that's the Environmental Law Initiative, and the Lawyers for Climate Action New Zealand are taking the Minister for Climate Change to court over the second emissions reduction budget or plan, saying that it's neither credible nor capable of achieving the targets. And in particular, they're worried about the amount of tree planting, and they're saying that this is the first time that there's been a court case challenging the use of widespread use of planting trees to offset fossil fuel emissions.
In the world?
Yeah, in the world.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Well, that's because we're in this unusual position where we accept the credits in our emissions trading scheme. Not completely unusual. I think Kazakhstan is the other one that has it, but we've got the biggest one, the one that's been around for the longest. And it is a fascinating thing. Also, how the government has used carbon sinks, so-called, carbon capture as their main way to achieve their zero target, which, as we've discovered, it may not be possible.
Yes, exactly. So something like a third of the emissions reductions that are required in that budget were attached to that single project, that carbon capture and storage project, which the owners of the project, which it's one of the gas fields, it might be Kapuni, I'm not sure, but have basically said, well, that project is not economically viable because the carbon price isn't high enough.
And partly that's because of all of the forestry credits dumped in there, right?
Yeah. It's all quite secular. So,
Do we need to get the Minister for Climate Change on to talk about this? Because the whole thing is just slipping away. Every week there's another bit of news that we're not really serious about this, and then we call the climate scientists the worthies. Do we need to get them on to actually have a conversation about where we stand on all of this? Because there's a rather sort of discreet, or possibly even rather New Zealand passive-aggressive approach here by the government of just letting it happen.
I'd be very surprised if they actually want to talk to you about that. But the point of this court case is that they're going to have to go to court and talk about it. So the lawyers are actually going to say, you have to come in court and explain this to people. And I think generally speaking, the courts are quite reluctant to kind of force the government to run, policies in particular ways. But if nothing else, we get the chance to see, the minister being grilled and being asked to explain this and to justify, their decision making and whether it's actually credible. So.
Yeah, there's been none of that sort of. You've got Shane Jones, of course, with his Dig Baby Dig and so on, and we've got this case coming up with the seabed mining in Taranaki, but there's very little from the government about the reality of this. I just feel as though we're drifting.
In this, they actually said that in this court case that. Compared to the first reduction plan, this government has cancelled 35 individual policies and actions without any kind of consultation with the public. And they have replaced all of that with these, mostly with planting pine plantations, and secondly with that carbon capture and storage project. And that those just are, that's quite a fragile plan. And we've already seen actually that plan is bust because of the CCS issue. But that just emphasises how fragile the plan is. It's just not strong or credible enough, and it's not coherent with the targets that we have in place. So.
Yeah,
and
it's almost.
There were two. Sorry, Bernard, you go ahead. I'm sorry.
It's a performative approach. I think this is the government which doesn't want to be seen to be, some sort of, climate denying Neanderthals, but in actuality they are not taking actions or to either reduce emissions or taking actions that would repair the damage from previous policies. And at
I
some
think
point,
that's
someone has to sort of call bullshit on it.
I think that's a really important point, because I've had it thrown at me a couple of times lately that, we're very lucky in New Zealand that we have a cross-parliament agreement on that climate change is real and that we should be doing something about it, and that we have these policies in place in the first place. But, I think that kind of overstates the case a little bit, in the sense that we had a government under John Key who very much recognised that we needed to be seen to be doing something. But being seen to be doing something is a very, very different objective to actually doing something. And I think we've sort of flipped back. We've got this flip-flopping of policy, where we're getting policy whiplash, in fact, where we move from actually doing something about it to just putting in place these flimsy, fragile kind of programs that are designed to make it look internationally like we've got a plan, when in fact we're just trying to skate by without one.
And we're now at the, for the want of a better word, fuck around to find out stage. We're at the finding out stage, because the trading partners, the EU and the UK, are starting to notice. International, arbiters, if you like, people who are the worthies, the people who are actually, the scientists and the experts who've been looking at this are saying, hey, actually, you're not doing what you said you were going to do, and you're not doing enough. And then finally, actually, the courts issue, I think, is fascinating, where in New Zealand, the courts don't have the same sort of, prime role that you have, say, in the United States. And we constantly have these situations where courts interpret the law in an inconvenient way for the government. And so then the government, quickly will change the law. And so,
that's right.
And that will be the next step. If we see the courts do what they've done in various cases with the treaty, and then force the government to essentially retroactively, get back into it, that's when the real moment hits, when you can say, okay, it's just performative. You don't really care.
Well, just hearing you say that and hearing what Catherine's saying, I was wondering also whether, and it would of course go down rather well at the moment, given ACT's treaty bill and so on now dormant, but whether there is basis under the Treaty of Waitangi to take a climate claim against the government for inaction.
Actually, what's interesting, the ELI, the Environmental Law Initiative, has been involved in some court cases in the South Island quite recently against ECANS, which is the Canterbury Regional Council, on water quality, and they are acting on behalf of Ngāi Tahu, who are looking to have a stronger role in governing the waterways, because the Regional Council has basically failed to protect them to the degree that I think most people would want.
No, I think that's a really interesting kind of inroad to this, which would of course cause a stink, but it's a very interesting inroad to it. Catherine, there are two other things that you wanted to talk about. One I wanted to sort of bring you in. One was about there being insufficient satellites to monitor what's going on, and the second one, this decision that we've seen from the US today to fire all of the people from the National Organization for Atmospheric Research that put out climate.gov, which is like a worldwide resource for climate change information, right?
I think these two stories are very related to each other. So the first one is about something called the Earth's energy imbalance, which we currently have a system for measuring this via satellites, and basically that's looking at the difference between the amount of energy that comes into the Earth's atmosphere from the sun versus the amount that is radiated back out. And if those are out of balance, and they are, and most of that we know is caused by greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gases. So that's the extent to which we end up heating, right? And what we have seen in the last 2 decades is that the EEI, or the Earth's energy imbalance, has basically doubled over those 2 decades, and that is out of alignment with what our climate models are saying ought to be happening. So that is a big question mark that a lot of people have a lot of anxiety about trying to understand what's happening in order to understand what's going to happen in the future. Now, at the moment, there's a situation where a bunch of those satellites that are currently used for measuring that energy imbalance are coming to the end of their life cycles, and they're about to be decommissioned. And there's a few ideas floating around for different ways of measuring things, but those ideas are currently unfunded, and they wouldn't happen until the late 2030s, even if they were funded. So there's this real concern that there's going to be a gap in between where we will lose visibility and monitoring capability over that measure unless NASA invests more money in covering that gap. And at the moment, obviously the US government doesn't seem particularly interested in monitoring or communicating about climate change. And that's sort of backed up by the story that you put forward about the NOAA laying off a whole bunch of people that ran their main climate change website that communicated the science of climate change, not just to the US citizens, but beyond that as well. And so with both of those things going on, it leaves this big question about why do they not, what is the real story behind this? Why do they not want people to know what's going on or to understand what's going on with climate change? And there's a few theories about that, but none of them are very comforting.
Catherine, thank you. We're going to move to the international section, if that's all right. Thanks, as always.
Thank you.
People want me to talk to you about sarcasm weed, which I think is actually sargassum weed from the Caribbean, but we'll talk about that next week if you don't mind.
Brilliant.
Sarcasm weed is something I smoke too frequently. We're going to move to the international section. Andrew Gunn from Kiev, how are you?
Hi, I'm well, thank you. My audio loud and clear?
Yes, it is just fine. Now, Professor Robert Patman from Otago is there as well. Now, Robert, we're probably going to let Andrew take a little bit of the first part of this to describe what's going on in Ukraine. And then, of course, we'll get you to talk about Ukraine, and then I'd like to talk to you about AUKUS and Israel, Palestine. And I've just got a note from MFAT, which you will be interested by, about a story I just sent you today. Now, Andrew, let's just be clear with the audience. I mean, Simon, our producer, may take this away, but you're a close personal friend of mine, and you're living in Kiev and writing some excellent first-person material and doing much else in Kiev. Everybody, I know your parents are concerned about you, and you wrote a beautiful piece in The Listener maybe 2 weeks ago now, 10 days ago, about life in Kiev, and some really remarkable interviews with people literally on the front line, both of politics in Ukraine and the military front line. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, Andrew, was the mood and then the reaction to the extraordinary Ukrainian drone attacks on the Russian strategic nuclear air fleet.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a clear boost in morale for a lot of people here. I mean, the logistics required to pull something off like this were immense. And the SBU, Ukraine's intelligence service, has basically made an almost like a kind of mischievous tone recently to the Russians that they can expect much more of this in the future. And yeah, for a lot of people at a time where morale was being quite worn down and coming out at the end of a long and hard winter, yeah, I think a lot of people have really had their spirits lifted. And it's a reminder of how kind of like positionality has completely shifted in this war. And the fact that there are,
just explain, just elaborate on that, what you mean.
The fact that now that drones are such a massive part of this war, and Ukraine can really leverage kind of its intelligence and its technological sophistication to take on a much larger adversary in a way where front lines would traditionally kind of collapse like this and would be fought kind of along like a very close proximity. Now the fact that Ukraine can launch attacks on drones that have been shipped, all the way into central Siberia, about 4,000 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, and right up close to the Arctic Circle, close to northern Finland. It's extraordinary. And it's the fact as well, I think, I don't think this is something that necessarily is the first thing everyone's talking about, but was a big takeaway for me, is the fact that there are a lot of, not a lot, but there is a small minority of Russians that are collaborating with inside Russian borders to facilitate attacks like this. The there was an office that was near a there was an office from which this attack was coordinated, which was purportedly actually really close to a Russian intelligence headquarters, and there were local Russians collaborating there.
Yeah,
And
interesting. And one of the other aspects of this, of course, is the Russian threat of retaliation. You wrote in your piece in the Listener rather movingly about your ability to identify what was a Shahed drone, the Iranian designed drones that they've used. We've also seen big attacks overnight, I think, in Kiev, and you and I discussed the other day that 7 out of, I think, 10 Kiev districts had been hit. Do you get a sense of dread as well, or does it just mix to the normal sense of dread?
Unfortunately, these airstrikes are really normalized for a lot of people living here, although I have to say the intensity the other night was quite unlike nothing I've experienced. That might be partially because I've moved closer into the city center, and we were, I'm not sure quite how far, but I was large enough to one of the strikes to see a building burning kind of in the distance, and there was smoke that was pouring over my house. You could smell smoke in the air. So
how do you know when you need to go to an air raid shelter, or do you just not go anymore because it's become sort of a moot point?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. So short answer is I generally don't take shelter unless there is like a warning that there might be some kind of Orezhnik strike, or if we're expecting a large amount of ballistics. The other night, even though we knew there were ballistics
what's a Orezhnik
incoming,
strike?
Sorry, and Orezhnik is a new kind of missile that's been the Orezhnik, which can shoot multiple warheads.
And so how do you get warned at the moment? Is it sirens, or do you get a text? How do you, in your daily life, how do you know what's coming and when, in as much as you possibly can?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of information that comes out primarily on the Telegram messaging platform. The government themselves, the Ukrainian government actually doesn't usually issue these warnings directly because they can be held culpable if they get the information wrong, if they don't provide information, and then there is a kind of strike they weren't anticipating. So a lot of this comes through informal channels. It's basically people that have friends in the armed forces and so on that will get a text, and then they will send all the information out on Telegram, and you can see almost in real time text where people are saying, okay, look, there are 12 Shahed drones coming in from the north at this vector. We believe they're headed towards this location. 6 ballistic drones incoming from this direction, all of this kind of information.
How do you handle that? Yeah, sorry. So there's presumably, so the Shahed drones are winding. You mentioned, I think, in your piece, the sound of the Shahed drone, but also when you can hear either machine gun fire or automated machine gun fire, I don't know what, up to try and take it down. But a ballistic missile is a whole nother kettle of fish because it's rather fast, and so is the Qassam and so on.
Yeah,
forgive me. I'm sorry. The hypersonic missile. That's not a Qassam. Forgive me. Simon will delete that. Carry on.
So yeah, you have very little time to react if there is a ballistic missile incoming. So if you get the warning, you have kind of several minutes to get to a shelter. If it is a missile incoming, if it is a Shahed drone incoming, you have about half an hour generally. The missiles you can hear, we know that there are missiles that are beginning to hit because you can hear the depth of the sound of the impact, and you can also, the building might shake. My girlfriend and I should point out that my girlfriend and I actually had a conversation after the strike the other day, and we were saying, like, you know, we probably do need to start taking this more seriously because, you know, as Pete Hegseth announced the other day, you know, the US is slashing its military aid to Ukraine, and a few days ago they actually recently diverted a whole shipment of anti-drone missiles to, I believe, the Middle East. Their forces stationed in the Middle East. I might be wrong about the location, but they certainly diverted those drones. So we had a conversation about, you know, perhaps we do need to be more serious about going to our local metro station to seek shelter.
Bernard.
Go on.
Andrew, Bernard Hickey here. Thank you so
Hi.
much for coming on the show. Lovely to hear from you. And that detail about the informal warning system that's developed is fascinating. But
It's very Ukrainian. Yeah.
Yeah. It's very sort of we'd call it number 8 wire, I suppose, but it's a fascinating insight
It's number
into
8 fiber optic cable.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating to see how those informal networks build up. How do you work out which of the informal networks to trust, and how do you avoid, a whole bunch of bad actors jumping in there and saying, "Oh, here comes the new Shaheed, bloody blah. You all need to jump into your shelters," and there's nothing happening. How do you work out which are the right informal networks and the wrong ones?
That's a really good question, because there is a lot of Russian disinformation out there, in particular on the Telegram platform, which is actually a Russian-owned. Well, sorry, I should make it clear. Sorry, it is owned by a Russia. It doesn't have ties to the Russian state at all, but that is a question that some people do sometimes ask. But basically, I use a channel called Monitor. There is a limited number of monitors. This is not just any person that can text on this. There are a range of moderators that are vetted, and they're generally really accurate, because I can follow these updates and I can see, they'll say there are 2 drones over Pechevska's, where I used to live, and then I could hear them actually going overhead, and they might announce that one's been taken out. You could hear it explode. But to answer your question directly, so it's the fact that there are specific channels which are vetted, and which people trust.
And I'm also curious. About how the Ukrainians are feeling about this abandonment by the United States, and whether they think Europe can step up and provide the stuff they need.
Yeah, I mean, the abandonment from the United States. I mean, the feeling has been kind of a long time coming, in a way, since Trump's win at the election last year. Nobody was convinced that he was going to stick by Ukraine's side. A lot of people here suspect that he could be a Russian asset. I think more recently it's, people have started to doubt that, but it's clear that he's certainly on pretty close terms with Putin for a Western leader.
And it's very hard to ask you. It's very hard to ask you. We're asking you to give us the sense of an entire city and an entire nation, and of course you're a foreigner as well. One of the things that you've been very interesting about, I think, is also this aspect of how Russian-speaking Ukrainians and how Russian Ukrainians, as it were, in the East are sensing this, and the way it's pulling families apart. And of course, I imagine you've also done a certain amount of research or thinking about the idea of the Ukrainians being fascists and Nazis and Banderites. Is that what they're called? The Banderites. Banderites, which is the sort of quasi-fascist leader of the during the German invasion. And what's your sense of that kind of political milieu? And then I'm going to ask Robert to comment on a couple of things that you've said, please.
Yeah, so I think the question of language, like, it's not nearly as much of a fault line as some might have suggested. Of course, like, there is a lot of Russian propaganda that's been going around for years about, the Russian-speaking population, the ethnic Russian population of Ukraine is oppressed. This is really not true at all. There are still many cities, like Kharkiv and Odessa are good examples, especially Kharkiv, where a lot of people still continue to speak Russian. In Kiev, I hear Russian around me all the time. A lot of people have made, generally younger people, it's easier to make the shift because they would have gone through their education in school in Ukrainian language. A lot of younger people have made the shift as a conscious political decision. And I hear it kind of house parties and gatherings. There will be people that historically are Russian speakers, and they'll often switch into Surzhyk, which is a kind of hybrid language that's halfway between Russian and Ukrainian, to kind of be polite. But for a lot of people, it's not a big issue. In the west of Ukraine, it's slightly different because it's historically a more Ukrainian it's a Ukrainian speaking region. Sorry, what was the question exactly regarding
Well,
perceptions
it
of
was a
the
slightly,
Banderites?
well, but you want precision. You're on the wrong show, Andrew. It was really about, there are statues to the Banderites. There's statues, Is there any evidence to you in your daily life or your experience of Ukraine in the quite significant time now that you've been living there, of this kind of underlying fascist underpinning, historic underpinning, if you like?
Right. So Stepan Bandera, he's a very divisive figure here. A lot of people really like Stepan Bandera because he is kind of a person that fought for Ukrainian independence. But in doing so, to give more context to listeners that aren't familiar, he collaborated with the Third Reich. He collaborated with Nazi occupiers that were coming in from Germany. And there are a lot of people that kind of give counter arguments because he was swindled. He was sold out by the Nazis later on, and he ended up in a concentration camp. But his personal ideology was a kind
nationalist,
of ethno-nationalist fascist ideology. So I do personally have a real problem with the way that Bandera is put on a pedestal here. Oh, another thing I wanted to flag is so every now and again, you do see images of units which are using kind of Nazi symbols and so on in the Ukrainian armed forces.
We remember the Mariupol crew, of course.
Right, got you. There are some people that kind of engage with these images, but as far as I can tell, like the issue of the far right in Ukraine is much smaller than a lot of people think, and a lot of people in the there are individuals in the armed forces that might have this as a personal ideology, but I don't think as a political movement it's nearly as far spread as people think. Also, something you might find really interesting, in a cafe the other day, I noticed there were a whole lot of patches from people's uniforms that somebody had put up on a wall, and this kind of really captures the feeling here. There was literally somebody had put up a kind of I don't know if it's the Reichsengel or something. There's the name of this Nazi eagle, and I was like, oh God, is this really allowed to be up here? But then right next to it was a unit which had a menorah.
Yes.
That was really strange seeing those kind of side by side. But one thing I want to clarify really quickly though is that, as somebody pointed out the other day, I think a lot of soldiers engage with this stuff in a way where kind of they kind of feel like they're edgelords. It's kind of
it's
an edgy thing to do, but they don't really know. I know a guy that used to have a swastika on his elbow because he had this brief period where he flirted with this ideology when he was like a teenager, but then he got to the age of kind of 19 and was like, oh God, I'm going to have to. So he
that's
had
what
it
we
kind
all
of
tell our children
modified.
about their tattoos.
Yeah.
Robert, have you? I always talk to
go
Robert about his leather elbow patches rather than his Nazi tattoos from his misspent youth. But Robert, what do you think about what you've heard? I mean, it must put you, and I know I did warn you that I was going to put you to one side a tiny bit to get Andrew's on the spot feel. But what do you sense about what you've heard? Because it's always good to have somebody in the spot.
Absolutely, and there's no substitute for that. And I think Andrew's given us a fascinating account. I have many questions for Andrew.
Yeah.
One question, Andrew, it would be really good to get the sort of perspective from Kiev. One thing I've noticed that spectacular drone attack, which is multifaceted, which was, a tremendous feat, I believe, and I think many people believe. And it did change the whole parameters or the narrative around the conflict to some degree. And as you said, was a real boost to morale. One thing I've noticed is that there is quite a reluctance to accept this in the United States. There's a constant stream of articles which says that was a spectacular short-term triumph, but it doesn't change the realities on the ground. Now, the reason I'd like your perspective on that is because, a slight follow-up, perhaps answer the two questions in one go. Since that attack, and you hinted at this, Ukraine has really piled on the drone attacks. The Engels base, They attacked in the last 5 hours the electronics plant in Moscow. So they're really piling it on, but that gets very little coverage. And what I find interesting, many of the major mainstream media are constantly focusing on rather slow Russian progress at the front, but they don't cover much of the what I call the lower profile drone attacks. And I'd be very interested in your take. You know, you spoke about asymmetrical warfare. How do you see this panning out?
So, yeah, you're right. There are a lot of the smaller Ukrainian strikes that don't get nearly enough coverage. And yeah, the thing people need to remind themselves is all this stuff adds up. You know, when somebody said, oh, this only took a 30% of this category of aircraft which can carry cruise missiles, well, you know, what if there's another strike in the near future? And it's a reminder that the Ukrainians have the logistical and the technological sophistication in order to do this. Sorry, your question is specifically regarding how do I see this going on into the
I mean,
future?
Do you see these less publicized drone attacks which are going on nightly in Russia? I mean, this is really changing the war from Putin's point of view, particularly these drones going through Moscow, because all Muscovites are seeing this. So this is a quality shift in the war. And I'm just wondering, it seems to me this is a very concerted attempt to pick off the infrastructure which sustains the Russian invasion effort. And I'm just wondering, what's your sense of that, looking at it from Kiev's perspective?
Yeah, in terms of taking out infrastructure, of course, there are a lot of attacks on oil refineries, and oil, of course, is like, you know, the linchpin of Russia's, you know, the main element of Russia's economy. If these continue, and a significant amount of Russia's oil refineries can be taken out, and what's really not a diversified economy, it's going to take it's going to be a massive hit on the economy. And I think, yeah, like I said before, I think just to continually hitting, you know, Russian air bases, it's eventually going to have an effect. One thing is that there is sometimes this recurring theme of like, oh, if we bring the war back home to Russians, you know, if we remind them that, you know, 4,000 kilometers from the front, there is still a war going on in Ukraine, and it will come to affect you directly. The only question is, you know, Russia no longer really has a civil society. It is a totalitarian state. So you do have to ask the question, how do people exert pressure on the Kremlin? You know, it might be more a question of in future regime change, what that might mean for the next generation of political leadership. But yeah, we do have to ask the question, how do Russians put pressure on the political leadership, unless it is through a very organized kind of form of revolutionary action, like we came to see from Prigozhin.
Yes, I was going to say, and that ended well for him.
Yeah, that ended so well for him, didn't it? Yeah,
Andrew,
but we're going to
go on. No, forgive me. We're going to wind you off now, if you don't mind. You're welcome to stay, but I think we want to talk to Robert about AUKUS and Gaza and Israel. I will quickly ask, because one audience member said, "What is there a view in Kiev? Has anybody there got time to think about Gaza?"
Oh, that's a very interesting question. Yes. People do, of course, have time to think about Gaza. I think one thing that I really have a problem with here in Ukraine is, you know, there is you can compare perhaps Ukraine with Germany historically, in that it has a real sense of complicity in some of the atrocities against Jews in the Holocaust. And as a result, and there's a huge Jewish community here, and a lot of people have dual Israeli and Ukrainian citizenship. Same goes with Russia. And so in the earlier phase of the war, there were a lot of Ukrainians that were strongly supportive of Israel. I get the feeling that this is changing over time, and the government, in fact, has not been particularly supportive with Israel and has often voted against Israel in the United Nations. But there are many people that do see this parallel, that both are, both
and of course
Ukraine and
Israel has not
Palestine
been terribly supportive of Zelensky either, and of Kiev,
yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, and he's historically been quite close with Putin as well. So yeah, but I think it's increasingly more and more people do see the parallel between what Ukraine and Palestine are experiencing. Yeah, and
Andrew, thank you
I
so
hope that
much.
continues.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, people have really appreciated getting the sense of being on the ground there. And your parents and I would like you to keep your head down, please, and not be too brave. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much for coming on.
Great to talk.
Thank
See
you
you later.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks very much for everybody I thought we'd let Andrew, and particularly to you, Robert. I loved your questions to Andrew, putting the armchair general into the field in Kiev. Robert, we saw a really amazing, I thought, announcement today from the United States that they're doing a review of AUKUS. Now, Bernard is the big AUKUS boy, and then we exchanged some messages today where I said it would be a relief, and you said, Peter, from whom? And we'd see Malcolm Turnbull. I'm sure we'll see Keating. This is actually, well, what's your view of the US review of AUKUS before I impose my own opinion?
Well, I think it confirms a view that I picked up when I visited Australia a couple of years ago from some highly placed military people who were unconvinced that Trump, if he was elected president, would actually stick with AUKUS. He said that in the conversation and there was two sides to this particular coin that he was speaking about. On the one side, he doubted whether American firsters, as he called them, would be serious about looking after Australian national security. But the second side of that was that he doubted whether many Australians would particularly warm to the prospect of placing their security in the hands of Mr. Trump. That is to say that Australia was effectively linking itself through AUKUS to American grand strategy. And we, in a sense, the doubts about whether something I've only discovered recently, and it was through Malcolm Turnbull, and this is why Paul Keating and Malcolm Turnbull rubbished the agreement from the outset, was that there was always a clause in the agreement that if there was, for any reason, the United States did not have enough submarines, they had the option of not providing them. Yeah. So, Turnbull described this as a complete fiasco, as it would be, because there you are waiting for these submarines to arrive. Promised date, was it 2033? And suddenly 2033 appears, and the Americans turn around and say, sorry, guys, we haven't got those submarines to transfer to you. Sorry about that. And in the interim...
Robert, that would suggest that under Trump, the US might have become a slightly less reliable ally. That would never happen. Bernard, you are Mr. AUKUS. Your turn to ask Robert about this, because I think this is so interesting. I actually feel quite good about the conversations we've had with lovely Robert over the last couple of years about this, because we've given a lot of attention to Malcolm Turnbull and Keating and so on. This is just kind of inevitable, isn't it, for where we've been going on this?
Yeah, I mean, there's an element here of just wait until Trump loses his attention span on it or changes his mind, and hopefully it'll go away. And this is helping to, reinforce that view. And it was interesting to see the full page ad put into some of the newspapers this week by the worthies, the former prime ministers, who have said some things about AUKUS, and it just adds to this drumbeat of this is a difficult thing to get into. It might actually make sense just to soft pedal on this and just see how it goes, because the longer it goes on, the more politically difficult, economically difficult, militarily difficult it is to join up to something like this.
I absolutely agree, Peter. And I think you've just hit the nail on the head, because the rationale, often people lose sight of why AUKUS was created. The official rationale was to bolster and uphold the international rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific. So the assumption was there was only really one threat to the international rules-based order, and it was in the Indo-Pacific, and it was from China. Now, the problem is that since then, and it wasn't just Trump, the Biden administration didn't uphold the international rules-based order in Gaza, and the Trump administration doesn't even pay lip service to the international rules-based order. So from a New Zealand point of view, and New Zealand does depend, as the Ministry of Defence have readily conceded, critically depend on the international rules-based order. What's in it for us? I mean, you know, we're confronted now with two superpowers which are very selective about their commitment to the rule of law internationally.
Well, that brings, carry on, because that brings me, just thinking about both time and the importance of the story, to the story that broke. Is that all right if I move us on to the Israel story? Just because I think, exactly to your point, Robert, because you're always so good on this, and I know you have a book coming about it, but this international, the United States, according to Reuters, the United States, it's an exclusive report from Reuters, has issued a diplomatic démarche urging the United Nations and Saudi Arabia and Israel and all attendees at this meeting not to have a meeting later this month to talk about Palestinian statehood as part of the Israel-Palestine thing. And let me just find the it is an extraordinary démarche, because it says that they want to discourage governments from around the world from attending a UN conference on a two-state solution. The United States opposes any steps that would unilaterally recognize a conjectural Palestinian state, which adds significant legal and political obstacles to the eventual resolution of the conflict, and could coerce Israel during a war, thereby supporting its enemies. I mean, it's a very... I'm not sure I've ever quite seen, I mean, it's a good story from Reuters, I'm not sure I've ever quite seen a kind of diplomatic note that would normally be private coming out this way and essentially saying, do not go and discuss the idea of a two-state solution, and certainly do not recognize a putative Palestinian state.
Yeah, but I think the Trump administration...
There was a question hidden in there, Bernard.
I think the Trump administration could be setting themselves up here for a major embarrassment. After all, what are they complaining about? Every administration going back to at least the early 90s has called repeatedly for a two-state solution. The Biden administration did. Now, the Trump administration was lukewarm during the first Trump administration, but doubts that America was committed, at least in theory, to a two-state solution were dispelled during the Biden administration. We now have the spectacle of the United States doing a U-turn on what's been a long-standing US position, and then reprimanding the rest of the world because they haven't done a U-turn as well.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, and then they said, I heard this phrase so many times, we're working around the...
followed by a 180?
Sorry?
Is that a 180 followed by a 180?
Yeah. But the other thing that really strikes me as really significant, they've taken the same phrase from the Biden narrative, that we're working round the clock to get a ceasefire, and this is not helpful. The United States cast yet another veto on the 6th of June, or round about the 6th of June, the fifth one they've cast to prevent a UN Security Council sponsored ceasefire. So not only are they the biggest obstacle, have been so far, to a ceasefire, at least one supported by the majority of the UN General Assembly, but they've now done a U-turn and expect everyone to follow. I think this is delusional. One European diplomat, and it was the article you sent me, Peter, I think he said at the end, this is going to probably generate an angry reaction from many countries which have loyally followed the American lead on the two-state solution.
Yeah. Well,
what about our position as a country? We've always said we stand for a two-state solution. Mr. Peters repeated that this week. Is he suddenly going to say, "Oh, I've given up on the two-state solution"? Mr. Trump says it won't work.
Excellent segue, because I just got an email from the very nice people at MFAT, because I found this absolutely flabbergasting, although not as flabbergasting as I would have found it had I not listened to Mike Huckabee, the US ambassador to Israel this morning. But the MFAT people, so yes, New Zealand, they said, because there's actually a threat in this US démarche, which is a diplomatic note. It's essentially warning France, Saudi Arabia, and New Zealand not to attend this conference, and not to take actions that would interfere with Israel. And so MFAT officials talk that they will be attending the French-Saudi two-state solution conference in New York later in this month. And then they sent me very kindly, because they're all good people, the current New Zealand position on a two-state solution. And one of the things that I thought was interesting in it, Robert, even though it's, we go through this from time to time and it's restated and it gets turned into a tweet, it is pretty clear from it that we are not going to be preemptively recognizing a Palestinian putative state in the way that Norway and I think Sweden and Spain have. Because it says, a two-state solution with the state of Palestine living in peace and security side by side with the state of Israel is the only blueprint for peace we have. And then it goes on, but, and I'm sorry, I'm putting those Peter Bales square brackets, bluntly asserting statehood unilaterally at this point, however well-intentioned, would do nothing to alleviate the current plight of the Palestinian people. Indeed, it might impede progress. So, New Zealand's going to travel sanctions Smotrich and the other extreme minister in the Israeli cabinet, but we are not going to preemptively recognize a Palestinian putative state. Is that right, Roman? Is that how you take it?
Yes, but I think that's a lot to do with trying to keep the communications open with Washington. They're going to defy Washington over attending this conference, but they're not going to go to the direction that Mr. Macron, the French president, President Macron, has indicated that he may be in a position now to recognize a Palestinian state. The reason why there's urgency on this is because Israel is changing the facts on the ground.
Yes.
And so you could turn it the other way around and say it's never been more urgent to preemptively recognize the state of Israel, because soon the territory where that state was planned to be located is disappearing. It'll be part of a greater Israel. And, we are seeing Mr. Netanyahu doesn't make any bones about this. He wants to control Gaza. And Smotrich and others within the cabinet have said that the West Bank will be annexed in 2025. That's what they're planning to do. So what is New Zealand going to do? Wait till those territories are effectively taken over and say, we'll support a Palestinian state, although there's no territory for that to happen. It's an interesting position to take, but I'm not sure strategically it's the wisest approach.
Yeah. So, Robert, let me just ask you contentiously. We'll just do this for maybe 90 seconds or something, because Bernard and I have got to find a way out of this show today eventually. Sure. But Mike Huckabee, the US ambassador to Israel, said today and overnight to Bloomberg and to the BBC that the United States will no longer push the idea of a two-state solution. He said there is no such thing as the West Bank. It is Judea and Samaria. It's been given by God. And then he suggested that Arab states, and he made one of those extraordinary calculations about how much bigger Arab and Muslim states are around Israel, for them to create a Palestinian state, which of course would be outside of Palestine. Hasn't he just essentially blown the gaff on a myth of the two-state solution, which has been a myth for certainly since Oslo?
Well, he certainly, I think, pinpointed the gap that's existed between America's declaratory position, i.e. wanting a two-state solution, and its willingness to really put pressure on Israel to bring that about, which has been sadly lacking. It was a bit like Mr. Biden constantly wringing his hands about the high level of Palestinian civilian deaths, but not to the point where he'd stop arming Israel. And so that, yes, Huckabee has taken this step. But with respect, America's never been a disinterested observer. It's always been in a position where it's committed to one side of a territorial conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. Because America takes this position, it doesn't mean that is the end of the story, particularly if the rest of the world disagree. And by the way, my view is that, judging by the way people have reacted in the UN General Assembly, which, whatever its faults, does actually reflect to some degree what countries think, I think there'll be strong resistance to what America's proposing. The question is, how will other liberal democracies respond when America is complicit, if it becomes complicit, I hope it doesn't, in the eviction of Palestinians from where their families have been living for a long time? This is, after all, let's be quite blunt. If we saw this in the other part of the world, this would be described as ethnic cleansing.
Yes, I thought it was interesting that there was so much criticism of the travel sanctions and against the two ministers, when, of course, the ICC could easily have also included them. The International Criminal Court could have perhaps included them in its indictments.
Yes, but I think the International Criminal Court, which has been under a lot of pressure from the United States, even before the sanctions were imposed by the Trump administration, probably wanted to go for what they saw as the people most prominently involved.
Yeah.
And certainly those two people have been sanctioned, as the British Foreign Minister pointed out, David Lammy, have been responsible for providing much of the narrative. But Netanyahu, obviously the chief decision maker in Israel, and the former defense minister, Gallant, played critical roles in launching the so-called campaign of mighty vengeance in Gaza. So it's interesting, isn't it, that the administration has taken this view. As I say, I do think the United States is overestimating its leverage in the world generally at the moment, and it'll be interesting to see. The domestic situation in the United States is not doing America's diplomacy any favors. Mr. Trump's handling of the Los Angeles riots is not giving his diplomatic efforts in the Middle East a real edge, quite the opposite. And many countries are watching this with considerable interest.
Robert, thank you so much. I think we've actually been pretty good on this story for a while, because we've talked many times about Huckabee and about the extreme side of this. Thank you so much for that, and we'll
thank you.
next week.
Thank you, Robert. Great to
thank
I
you.
think this one will run and run. Bernard, you have a couple of quick soliloquies.
They'll be very quick to keep life simple for Simon. I am fascinated by the announcement this week of the new CVs for Auckland, which show an average price fall of around about 9%, and in some of the weaker areas, as much as 15%. Interesting, Great Barrier Island, or Aotearoa, its prices are up 38%. But anyway, this plays into my...
How did Waiheke do, Bernard? I know you will have looked at that.
Don't care. No,
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
10%,
I'll be here. I'm never selling. It's all right. The thing I find fascinating is that New Zealanders, for the first time really in living memory, are having to think about house prices not continually rising or not bouncing back very quick, which is what they did in 2009-10. And we're in this point now, a big standoff, where the owners are saying, well, I'll just wait. And there's an element, it sounds a lot like Trump actually, we'll just wait for him to go away. And there's a whole bunch of people waiting for the market to bounce back, and it isn't. And that's because the jobs market is weak. The government is not spending money. When the government pulls back, you need the private sector to step forward and invest with borrowing. That's usually the housing market. And certainly one of the most interesting stats I've seen over the last week, and I haven't been looking that closely, so it really popped out, was that over the last 4 years now since COVID, we have seen an extra $100 billion worth of borrowing into the housing market. That include that boom time, but less than $5 billion in extra borrowing to the business sector. So what this means is that the government, who are arguing that if it pulls back, the business sector will step forward and the housing sector will step forward, they can give up on the business sector doing that because people don't invest anymore in their businesses in the same way that we used to think they did, because they know they get a much better return out of housing. And the banks are restricted, artificially you could argue, by the Reserve Bank in how they are lending through LVRs, DTIs and the higher capital controls. Without a Reserve Bank governor choosing to loosen those capital controls, the government's not going to get the housing market boost that they were hoping for from these lower interest rates. And that relationship then between the central bank governor and the finance minister or the government is really important. And that's
So
why
did you are
and
you
that's why
suggesting that the Adrian Orr thing is connected to house prices as well, Bernard?
everything is always about house prices, Peter.
So just elaborate on that, because I don't think this has been covered well enough, although Jenny Tibshere has done some very good stuff on it. Yeah.
So the other news we got this week was the finer detail around the departure of Adrian Orr, which is now very clear due to a dispute between him and the Reserve Bank board, and therefore by extension the government, over the budget for the Reserve Bank. Now, he was facing big cuts in his budget, and he said, no, we can't deal with that. Now, the other tension that's been there between Adrian Orr and Nicola Willis is around the capital restrictions for banks, and by extension the LVRs and the DTIs. And although it's not the direct reason for the clash and the departure of Adrian Orr, I think that underlying tension is a key one, because if Nicola Willis really wanted to get rid of Adrian Orr because of this problem with capital requirements and LVRs and DTIs, the one lever she has to push out a governor she doesn't want is to kill his budget. And and she used it, she pulled it, and he went. Now, the reason we didn't know about it in the sort of detail we do now is because the Reserve Bank chairman chose not to release it or talk about it, which is fairly extraordinary. But in retrospect, you can sort of understand it when you have an unusual
stability. But
exactly.
Was he a dickhead? This is this chap Quigley. Is he a plonker as well?
Neil Quigley. I think he's been criticised rightly for appearing not very transparent at the time. He would argue that it helped keep the currency stable and the financial market stable during an extraordinary period, which it did. It did work. But there is collateral damage to the Reserve Bank's reputation for transparency out of this. And I have to say, I'd be surprised if Neil Quigley stuck around for too much longer. He was, the chair under or over Adrian Orr, and was never popular. Orr was never popular with National, and wouldn't surprise me if when the next time for a reappointment comes, we have a new chair. But it's
but Bernard, this is front page news, isn't it? I mean, if you I'm not sure, just sort of to talk about media a tiny bit. I mean, Jenny Tibshere has done a very good job on this, but this is huge. Imagine if Mark Carney, who was the Bank of England governor at the time, had been fired because of his opposition to Brexit.
Yeah,
this is what we're talking about the independence of the central bank, which is central to the modern perspective on our currencies and our debt and everything else, right?
Yeah, I'm often surprised at the lack of front pageness of our coverage of economics and business. I think that's partly because the senior figures who were the columnists and the editors and business pages are just not there anymore. Some of them have gone
to do their very successful Substacks, though, Bernard.
Yeah. For a lot of people have gone. There's not the sort of heavyweights, if you want to call it, that you would have had in the past. And a lot of the news judgments about front pages and the tops of bulletins are now very much lowest common denominator. What is it that's going to get the punters in through the door today? It's Taylor Swift. It's Donald Trump.
Prices.
House prices. You see this? I could give you a pretty good lowest common denominator argument to get in there, but I'm not the editor of the.
I agree. You've made it. See, the thing is, you've made it about the economy and about houses and about prices. And I think you're right that this needs to be done better. Bernard, I think we better do the quick skateboarding dog, because
Yes,
poor old
please.
Simon will be pulling whatever little hair he has left out, because I know where there's some edits in there. But apart from your hair, as we know, when I come to London, I'm often in a place with foxes, and there's a marvelous story in The Guardian today, which is a classic one of the let's not ask a question too far in case it doesn't actually stand up. Google has built an absolutely enormous building in London as its new headquarters. It's called the Land Scraper, because it's as high as the Shard is, but it's as long as the Shard is high, and it has a huge garden on top, which goes, I think, from the 5th to the 9th floor. And according to The Guardian, foxes have moved to the top of the building and are digging holes in the garden on the 9th and 7th floors, and living quite happily as they do throughout London. And I just, I think, would anybody object if I imported a fox to New Zealand, or a breeding pair of foxes to New Zealand, and see what happened? Because they're bloody adorable. But I just thought that was really cool that this land scraper now has foxes, urban foxes in London.
There's foxes infesting Google. No, it's great, but please don't bring them to New Zealand. They are cute.
What did the fox say? What's that fantastic Norwegian
What did the fox say?
It was, what did the fox say? Exactly.
That's right. Thank you very much,
Thanks,
everyone.
Bernard. Lovely to see you. I'm sorry we didn't see the hair, but we'll see your hair next week, hopefully,
Indeed.
as it were.
Yes. Ka kite anō, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.